everyone. It's a delight to see you all here. My name is Norman Goda. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies, and it is my honor to introduce our speaker today. Michael Brenner is the Seymour and Lillian Abensohn Chair in Israel Studies and also the director for the Center of Israel Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. He is also professor of Jewish history and culture at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and he has held visiting appointments at numerous places, including Budapest, Vienna, Stanford, Berkeley, and Johns Hopkins. He has 9 books that have been translated into over 10 languages. I will only mention a few. He is the co-author of a magisterial 4-volume German Jewish history in modern times, for which he was awarded the National Jewish Book Award. In Search of Israel, The History of an Idea is one of his major works on Israel. If you've taken classes with me, then you know the Renaissance of Jewish culture in Weimar Germany, and his most recent effort he will discuss today, In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution, and the Rise of Nazism. Michael also publishes widely in the international media, ranging from pieces in the Washington Post to Der Spiegel in Germany, and he is a usual commentator on PBS, international radio and television. He has numerous honors. He is the international president of the Leo Beck Institute for the Study of German Jewish History. He was awarded the Order of Merit in the Federal Republic of Germany in 2014. And in 2020, he was the first recipient of the Salo W. and Jeanette M. Baron Award for scholarly excellence in research on the Jewish experience. In short, if you are studying German Jewish history in the modern period, you cannot not come across the works of Michael Brenner. Now, his talk today was called Hitler's Insurrection and the Rise of Antisemitism. And as I said this afternoon, this is one of these subjects that we think we know everything about. But Michael has shown us in this book that we really don't. And this is a very fresh take on Hitler's 1923 insurrection, and I'm sure that this will be a fascinating talk. We will have questions afterwards. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming Michael Brenner.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction, for the invitation, and I feel really blessed being in this beautiful room and having such a big audience. So let me start with this. We will talk about 1923, which of course is the 100th anniversary this year. But before we get to there, I would like to go back to the end of World War I and speak a little bit about what happened in Munich in November of 1917. As you know, Germany lost World War I. After the war was over, the monarchies were overthrown and a first republic was founded in Germany. Even before the Kaiser, the emperor, had to go from Berlin, the Bavarian left Munich. It was November 7th, 1918. Well, he didn't go voluntarily, as you can imagine. There was a revolution, but it was a non-violent revolution. And I won't go into detail because we have to come to 1923, but it was a revolution which was initiated by a rather unlikely figure who was not what you would expect in rather conservative America. He was a social democrat, he was a Prussian, and he was a Jew. Kurt Eisner was a journalist born in Berlin, but had lived in America, lived in Munich for a long time, in Bavaria first, and then Nuremberg and Munich. He became a pacifist during World War I, when he was one of the co-founders of a group that split from what they called the majority Social Democrats, and they call themselves the Independent Social Democrats. Who there's one place left in the front if anyone wants to sit there. And he became one of the leaders of, or the leader in the end of the Independent Social Democrats in Bavaria. And when the war was over, or the war was coming to an end, November 7th, 1918, there were two demonstrations in a place many of you might know in Munich. It's the place where every year in actually September, one of the biggest parties in the world takes place, the Oktoberfest in September. And at that time, November 7th, was the leader of the majority Democrats and the leader of the independent Democrats. The majority Democrats were a much larger group. But what did they do after their protests, after their demonstrations over? They went home. Kurt Eisner and the independent, a bit more radical Social Democrats, they didn't go home. They went to the barracks where the soldiers were. They went to the places where the workers lived. And a little bit to their own surprise, these groups joined them. And it was clear that during that night, from November 7th to November 8th, there was a very strong feeling of the king no longer being welcome. And as I said, it was a non-violent place. In fact, here's just a few sentences from what the palace administrator wrote down here. And that's how he described the revolution. When the most sovereign gentleman had left the residence, I shut the windows in the royal palace, helped extinguish the lights, and after the official on duty and the footman who had no further instructions had left, I closed all the doors and made my way to the chapel courtyard. And that's how the king left of the House of Wittelsbach, which had ruled Bavaria for over 700 years. So the new person in charge was this gentleman, Kurt Eisner, as I say, a Social Democrat, born in Berlin, not from Bavaria, and Jewish. Now, there were no Jewish high officials in the sense of government ministers in Germany before that. So for many people, that was something very unusual. Of course, there were also many who saw that as a completion of the Jewish emancipation. Now, finally, a Jew could actually be prime minister, or in America, you might say governor of a German state, of Bavaria. And it didn't last long. Kurt Eisner, from the very beginning, was attacked, of course, as a socialist, but also as a Jew. I went for the research of this book to see his archives, which are in Berlin today. And there are two big boxes which are full of anti-Semitic letters calling on him, go to Palestine and found your state there, and way more terrible things, calling basically to kill him. And that happened on February of 1919. A young 20-year-old right-wing extremist assassinated Kurt Eisner, who was actually on the way to resign because he had his party had lost the election which he called for, and he was assassinated on the way. This is to the left. You see the place where some soldiers stand around the place where he was assassinated, and it was followed by what was by then probably the largest funeral that ever took place in the city of Munich, larger than any of the king's funerals before. The reports speak about 100,000 people, even though it lost the elections, even though it was not, but people really gathered to mourn him. One of the interesting moments at this funeral was the fact that this person to the left, Gustav Landauer, another Jewish revolutionary, gave the main eulogy. And among the sentences he said, in front of all these people, he actually eulogized, as he said, Kurt Eisner the Jew. It was very interesting. He did not, none of these people were, of course, religious in the traditional sense or members of an organized Jewish community, but they also didn't renounce their Judaism or their Jewishness, I should say. And of course, the two groups, I would say, who especially noted that they were Jewish, were the anti-Semites on the one hand, and the Jewish community on the other hand. The Jewish community was, and we'll get to this in a moment, was not, in their majority, soon were not too happy to have a lot of Jewish revolutionaries here. But this person, I'm sure known to some of you here, was the most important, or emerged then as the most important German Jewish philosopher, Martin Buber. And Buber was a very close friend of Landauer. He came and visited Landauer in February 1919. In fact, he was there the day Eisner was assassinated. And when he went back, he wrote to a friend, this whole thing, an unspeakable Jewish tragedy. So there were contemporaries who realized there is something quite, I am not even, evaluating it, but special in the fact that most of the leaders of this revolution and the Act II, which started here, which were Soviet or Council republics, starting in April 1919, most of those leaders happened to be Jewish as well. Of course, the anti-Semites did not, that didn't go unnoticed by the anti-Semites. One returning soldier from World War I, who happened to be in Munich at the time, was Adolf Hitler. And Hitler later wrote in 1923, in Mein Kampf, in 1924, sorry, in Mein Kampf, in his, political pamphlet and memoir, that was the moment he decided to become like a political fighter. I don't know if that is true. We don't have to believe it, but at least that's what he made the world believe, that this moment when you had Jews and socialists in, running Bavaria, that couldn't happen. Germany could not be ruled by Jews or socialists. And that's what he later ruled. These are some of the leaders of this revolution and the later phase of the so-called Council republics. Three of them actually were quite important intellectuals and writers, Gustav Landauer and scholar Erich Uedam. And the last leader of the most radical communist Council of Soviet Republic is called Eugen Levine, who was the only Russian-born of those. So this is a little bit, I would say very important for the background of the later story. And we can discuss later if that really caused the radicalization in Munich, or if it was a good excuse for many of, or pretext for many of the right-wing radicals to become anti-Semitic. Let's talk a little bit, and that's something I thought was a new element I tried to add to the story, because nobody had looked closely to how the local Jewish community reacted. The local Jewish community was actually the local Jewish community in Munich, just to show you a picture, this is the synagogue which was built in the 1880s. This is the main symbol of Munich, the Frauenkirche, the women's church. It's an impressive building. It was a community not comparable to Berlin, which had about 170,000 Jews, But it had about 12,000, a community of about 12,000 people. Many of them had come from villages in Bavaria and moved there recently, but they're very proud of their Jewishness and also of not just being German, but being Bavarians. There are stories how even when they prayed in Hebrew, their Bavarian accent, not the German, the Bavarian accent was noticeable. And one of the famous families, the Feuchtwanger family, known especially by the writer Leon Feuchtwanger, was one of the best-selling authors later in the 1920s, 30s, also in America, by the way. His family, not himself, but his family were Orthodox Jews, and they had reserved a Stammtisch, a regular table, at the best known, the typical Bavarian beer hall in Munich, the Hofbräuhaus. And every Saturday, after their prayer, in the afternoon, they would have either coffee or beer, which was kosher, of course, in the Hofbräuhaus. Of course, they couldn't pay because you couldn't touch money or bring money. So, they would come back. The people knew that the next day on Sunday and paid then. But this was the Bavarian kind of, even the Orthodox Jewish people. They felt very Bavarian. And they did not love the fact that here were these Berlin-born, left-wing Jews who made a revolution. They themselves were mostly, slightly conservative. Some of them regretted that the king was no longer in charge. And they knew that if the revolution would fail, they would be blamed. In Moscow, there was a saying that Trotskys make the revolution, and the Bronsteins, which was actually Trotsky's real name, the Bronsteins paid the price. So, it's the Eisners and the Tollers and the Landauers who make the revolution, but the Cohens and the Frankels and the established Jewish families in Munich, they would pay the price, and they were not wrong with that. One of them, the leader of the Orthodox Jewish community in Munich, a person called Seymour, who had a lot of honorary positions in the city. He was a very integrated middle-class citizen. He actually wrote an open letter, which was published in the newspaper. And what he says, these are just a few sentences. Bavarians, he says, indigenous Jews shout out by way of me to Bavaria's population, our hands are clean of the horrors of chaos and of the misery and suffering that you, and he means the Jewish politicians, that your politics must conjure up for Bavaria's future development. You alone and only you have full responsibility for this. And of course he claimed that they were, and he wouldn't recognize them fully as Jewish. So this is a little bit to show you the reaction and the fear, which was well-founded, of the local Jewish population. How did the story continue after the failure of this revolution? So, as I say, Eisner was assassinated. There were two short-lived councils. Soviet is just the Russian word for councils. Republics. And then in May 1919, this whole experiment of socialism in Bavaria was pretty brutally suppressed. That was now a bloody reaction. People like Landauer, he was brutally killed, actually. Another leader, Lillian, was executed. Others were imprisoned. And Bavaria became what the new leader called, over time, Bavaria became the most conservative and right-wing state within Germany. They called it the Ordnungszelle, the cell of order within Germany. And the person who was now a strong man in Bavaria for the next few years is called Gustav von Kahr. He was no Nazi, but he was a very conservative politician in Bavaria. and wrote a long memoir, which is unpublished, but you can see it in the Munich archives, over 1,000 pages. And it is actually full of anti-Semitic remarks. Just one example of the Bavarian people is letting itself be enticed and terrorized by the Prussian Jew and his clan. Sorry, but there are many more anti-Semitic remarks in this diary, which come from, he explains it already in there, from his education as a child growing up. Not in Munich, but in a small town Bavaria. And other important, even maybe more important person in Bavaria was the leader of the Catholic Church, the Archbishop. Later he became Cardinal, Michael Faulhaber. And he clearly, he becomes Archbishop in 1917, so he actually lived through all different phases of German history until the late 1950s. So he was Archbishop and then a Cardinal in Imperial Germany under the King, then the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, and later in the Federal Republic after World War II. And again, his diary was just found recently and is being published now online. And I found this very interesting because when you compare it with the witnesses we have and the documents from the Jewish community leaders, they thought they'd have actually a friend in him. And the rabbi comes very often to ask him for help when the situation is critical and anti-Semitism is being felt. And he thinks he might get his support, but in the diary now, I looked up the days when the rabbi came. Oh, the rabbi is here again. He thinks I will help him. But the Jews, the rich Jews, they can help themselves. And he really doesn't do anything to help them when the situation is critical. He also thinks it's impossible that a Catholic state like Bavaria, I should say Christian state because there were many Protestants in other regions of Nuremberg. Kahr actually was not Catholic or Protestant, but he actually said it's not the same whether the people look up to a king with trust in the sense of religious obligation, or whether they say, what does that Jew have to do with us? So you see, it's not, nobody will respect a Jewish prime minister as a real authority. And we find quite a few of those comments. So this was one turn in Munich. After a left-wing government, we have a reaction to exactly other opposite, a right-wing, but again, not Nazi. Hitler and the NSDAP, the Nazi party, were already rising in 1920. They were still, very small party, but they were noticeable. All of the documents, the Nazi party and other right extremist organizations, and people like von Kahr try to distance themselves from them as well, but they did so in a way by sometimes trying to compete with them in anti-Semitic sentiments. It was a different kind of anti-Semitism, but for example, we'll come to this in a minute, he tried in twice to expel Jews from Bavaria who didn't have German citizenship, who were mainly East European Jews. I'll come to this in a minute. But in the meantime, what happens in Munich, and that is really different from other cities, especially Berlin or Hamburg or Frankfurt, is that many of the institutions of the city are now, you have anti-Semitism in many of those institutions. Definitely the courts. Just an example, the assassin of the Prime Minister, Kurt Eisner, the founder of modern Bavaria, the assassin was celebrated as a hero by not just his defender, that's obvious, but even the prosecutor and then the judge thought, there is somebody who wants to restore the old powers, the monarchy, who wants to bring back a conservative right-wing state, kind of state. And Eisner is seen as the traitor, of course, who brought, and he was not a communist, he was not even a radical socialist, but he wants to bring some kind of left-wing politics into Bavaria. So he gets away with a relatively mild sentence in the end, and he is celebrated by many students, for example, at the university. That's the assassin of Eisner. By the way, it is then the same judge who gives the assassin of Eisner a mild sentence, who will later be the judge over the Hitler trial, over his insurrection. We'll come to this later. The police, and in fact, this is the police chief, the head of the police of Munich in 1920, together with the von Kahr, the conservative prime minister. Now, he is one of the earliest followers of Hitler. And in 1923, he's no longer police president then, but in 1923, he's one of the insurrectionists who tries, goes with Hitler in a beer hall putsch and all that. So, in a way, the Jews of Munich know we don't have, if there's an anti-Semitic incident, we can't expect that much from going to a court, from going to the police. And what about politicians? Well, this guy just tried to expel Jews from Bavaria, so we can't expect too much from the government as well. And finally, as I said, the church, they thought they could actually, they would hear to them, that they would assist them, but they didn't. In fact, when I looked at the fact that despite these attempts to expel East European Jews as early as 1920, and then again 1923, they didn't succeed to do that. But not because the police, the courts, the politicians, or anyone else within the Bavarian establishment would come to their help. In the end, actually, it was the foreign diplomats who were decisive. And that was very interesting doing this research, because you can't just go to the Munich archives. It's so interesting what you find, for example, in the National Archives in Washington. There is a whole correspondence what starts with some of the most important Jewish families in the United States, German Jews, the Schiffs and others, the Warburgs, who have a personal relationship to the Secretary of State. So they say, their letters saying, what is going on in Munich? Not Berlin, not Germany, what's going on in Munich? There are attempts to expel Jews in 1920, and there is anti-Semitic backlash to what a few Jewish politicians did. Jews don't feel safe in Munich. And the Secretary of State writes to the ambassador in Berlin, and the ambassador writes to the consul general in Munich. So you have all these letters, and they're very interesting because, among other things, they also reveal some anti-Semitism in in the American State Department at the time, where some people say, "Oh yeah, the Jews they were the war profiteers," for example. You find that also in the American documents. And but in the end, the Americans, the American Consul General goes to the protests at the government. But more important are the Polish and especially Austrian consuls in Munich, because they get directions from their government saying, yes, the Bavarians want to expel East European Jews. Where are they going? They're going to Austria and Poland, but we don't want that. So they start to threaten the Bavarians, not because they love the Jews so much, because they didn't want to take refugees in. They say, if you expel our citizens to, back to our country, we will expel German citizens, or Bavarian citizens to Bavaria. And that's actually when it stops. That seems to do it. And we see in this period, as I said before, that's of course why is Munich so important in this whole history? Maybe not because there were a few Jewish politicians, and maybe not because there was a conservative backlash, but this person happened to be in Munich. He didn't only found the Nazi, the party was there before, he renamed it, he made it big. In 1920, 21, that's when he rose as a person who by then everybody knew him. It's really, that's really the fact why this story becomes a story that has nothing to do anymore with local history. It becomes a national and global history. That's the atmosphere in which Hitler rises. And you see, this is one of the party events, but you see him speaking in these big beer halls. That's where you speak in Munich, beer halls. That's the largest places to speak. And as I said before, in my talk, he said it was the rule of the Jew that was determined the beginnings of my political activity. Well, the truth is, we don't really know very much of what Hitler as a person thought and where he stood politically before the fall of 1919. There were some historians who even claimed he was part of some left-wing circles in early 1919 in Munich. I'm not sure that can't be proven either. But it also can't be proven that he was, that he had anti-Semitic or right-wing views, which are very clearly shown, because we don't have any writings by him. He didn't give any speeches either before 1919. So by the end of 1919, Hitler emerges as a major leader. And my book is called Hitler's Munich. Every publisher will say Hitler, I guess. It wasn't my favorite title. In Germany, it's actually, in German it's not called. It's called differently. But it's not really about Hitler. It's about, I would say, the stage the city gave him to do what happened, to use Munich as a yes, exactly. Thank you. That was the word. As a testing ground for what he did later. And he thought, oh, actually it works. My anti-Jewish rhetoric doesn't, it might actually help me, not damage. And the brutal methods he and his comrades already introduced in the early 20s helps. It helps so much. He becomes so much a figure in Munich that the most important, maybe intellectual for the city of Munich, the writer Thomas Mann, and later got the Nobel Prize, already in June of 1923, when he wrote for an American journal, actually, it was published in English, he says, Munich is the city of Hitler. That's quite, I was quite surprised when I found that statement, because that's early. And then he goes on and describes how Munich was really, how Hitler, with no office or no official function in the city, was in a way already the dominant figure in that city. That was just a few months before his failed coup. And later, this is a few years later, Thomas Mann said, Munich changed from a center of cheerful sensuality, artistry, and joie de vivre to a city decried as a hotbed of reaction, as a seat of all stubbornness, a city that could only be described as a stupid city, and indeed as the stupidest city of all. For a resident of Munich, you can't imagine, people that didn't love him for that, but he makes, like many others, makes this contrast of Munich being a really liberal city before the war, when Berlin was seen as the center of Prussian militarism and conservatism, and now it's the other way around. Now Berlin is the liberal city, and Munich becomes the playing ground, if you want, or the testing ground for these right-wing, not just the Nazi Party, for all kinds of right-wing extremists and their organizations. And in fact, many of the important writers, not Thomas Mann, who stayed in Munich, but many others left Munich already in the mid-20s. Leon Feuchtwanger, the writer I mentioned before, Bertolt Brecht, one of the most important German writers, playwrights, and many others left in the mid-20s, and they all went to Berlin because Munich seemed to be unbearable for them. Now here you see already one of the big assemblies of the Nazis in the early 1920s, and Hitler goes, all the way. By November 1923, I should say a few more words actually before I get to that. The situation for the Jews in Munich already becomes pretty bad in 1923. In January of 1923, a movie that really started very successfully in Berlin. It was a film of a play, one of the most important plays of the German state, written in the 18th century, classic by Lessing. It's called Nathan the Wise. And they made a film in Munich, actually, Munich Film Studios in 1922. It started pretty successfully in Berlin, and then they wanted to perform it in Munich in January of 1923. The problem was that it was the first play where actually there was a positive Jewish figure, a Jewish hero, Nathan the Wise. It's the essential play of religious tolerance, that all religions are equal and so on. The Nazi Party already in January 23 had so much power in Munich that they put pressure on the movie theater owners, and after like 2 days, they all took it out of the program because they threatened to, destroy the movie theaters. So it could not be performed in Munich. That's just one example how different the situation was there than, say, in Berlin or other cities. Another example, I mentioned before, this rather conservative, orthodox gentleman, Sigmund Frankl, who wrote the letter against the left-wing Jews, right? Which was published. We, indigenous Bavarian Jews, against those Prussian Jews. And he was attacked in the tram with his wife and son, was beaten up on the street because people, they didn't care if he was conservative, if he was left-wing. He was a Jew for them. And he was known in the city. And he was beaten up, and he died actually about a year and a half later. Some accounts it was, related to his beating up. So this was the situation. I also don't want to accept that wasn't the typical experience for the 12,000 Jews. They weren't all beaten up in the streets. They weren't like under constant threat. But there was something in the atmosphere that they all felt. The strength and the rise of this upcoming politician, Hitler, threats against Jews in the city. It tends to expel you if you didn't have a German citizenship, and so on. So there was something, I think, almost all Jews in the city felt. And it was in this atmosphere that on November 8th, 1923, which was, of course, the anniversary of the end of World War I, Hitler tries for the first time to come to power. There is a big meeting. There's no picture of it. Could have been something like that, but without the swastikas here, because it was not a Nazi Party meeting. It was the Bavarian Prime Minister, von Kahr, the guy we saw before, who gave a speech, and other members of his cabinet were there. In the middle of it, Hitler walks in with some of his comrades with, shotguns, and they fire some shots into the ceiling. They take von Kahr, the prime minister, in the back room. They come back after half an hour, and they declare now that they together will form a new government and will march on Berlin. I mean, for those of you who know European history, there's another march just a year before, right, in Italy, March on Rome, Mussolini, so that was a big example. So it looks like, for this moment, that the Bavarian Prime Minister, von Kahr, made common cause with Hitler. The truth is we don't really know what happened in these hours and what they discussed. Some historians said, well, for that moment, maybe the Bavarian leader thought he would go together with Hitler. he himself, von Kahr, later claimed, well, he didn't have a choice because Hitler came with his gun. And under that pressure, he just pretended to go with it. In any case, that was the beginning of this beer hall putsch, or insurrection, if you want, to throw over the government, or even together with the prime minister to form a new government in Bavaria, but throw over the government in Berlin, German government. A few hours later, in the morning of next morning, these are some of the scenes during that night. The next morning, it is clear that von Kahr either changes his mind or does what he always wanted and acts against it. So the insurrection is being suppressed. Hitler, some of his foot soldiers are actually being killed, and Hitler himself is also hurt. He dislocates his shoulder. He flees to a nearby lake, but he's caught later. And of course, the leader of the insurrectionists, there's a trial against him. It's the same judge who already had this very mild verdict against the assassin of the founder of Bavaria. And now we see another trial like that, where, yes, he has to put the trial because he tried to overthrow the government. But in the end, he actually gets away with, in the end, less than a year in prison. The prison isn't really a prison. I mean, that's during his prison time. It doesn't look like a prison, right? And he's able to receive his friends, Theodor Hess, and other leading Nazis. I would say it's more of a writer's retreat. And in fact, it was a writer's retreat because he was able to write Mein Kampf during this year of so-called imprisonment. And then he was let go again. This is, by the way, the whole group of the insurrectionists who were the trial. Hitler's the only one who deliberately deserted the uniform. And of course, the guy next to him is the World War I hero Ludendorff, the other big name of this putsch, of this coup attempt. So this is the situation. And what was interesting also is that night, something I think it's not that well known. That night, November 8th to November 9th, 1923, sees terrible scenes happening in Munich against both left-wing people and Jews. Everybody who they thought was Jewish, sometimes just guessing from the names, they tried to take out of their homes. Some were taken as hostages. Some of the reports really read like the same night, 15 years later, so-called Kristallnacht in 1938, which not by chance happened the same day, the same night, November 9th, 1938. If you don't know which year it is, sometimes you might think, oh, that's 1923, wow. So this is the atmosphere in Munich, 1923. Now you might think, it happens after insurrections, right? When I wrote the book, I had no idea it would be relevant for this country as well. And when it came out in English, I wrote in German first, but it came out in English, it was right after January 6th. It doesn't end with a failed coup attempt. The leaders, Hitler was, of course, back, and 10 years later, he was in power. He was quite popular, not only among his base, but among other, I would say, the more right-wing voters in Bavaria. And his party was, for the moment, was not allowed, the Nazi party was not allowed to run, but they ran under a different name. And they were actually quite successful in 1924 in Munich. And then, the situation, economy improves, situation in Germany improves. In 1928, the Nazi Party seems to be a marginal party. But once the economic and political situation became worse again, starting, of course, Friday, 1929, economic crash, and then the political polarization in the early 1930s, Hitler knows better now. He's like no longer trying to come to power in a coup, in insurrection, but he tries and successfully comes to power in a legal way, according to the Constitution. His party, the Nazi Party, still does never get a majority close to 50%, but it is the largest of many parties. And on January 30th, 1933, he is now appointed Chancellor of Germany by the aged, also World War I, Field Marshal, President of Germany, von Hindenburg. And so this is, in a way, I think one of the lessons he took. He said, Munich is a playing ground, or as a testing ground, worked pretty well. I could see what works and what didn't work. Antisemitism worked, actually. Some of my violent ways worked. But the insurrection did not really work, so we will try to come to power in a legal way. And it took some time, but he was back, and we all know what happened after that. Thank you very much, and I hope we'll discuss some of these questions. Sure. Who wants to start? Yes.
Okay. Are you for act and epilogue structure to tell the story, or are you suggesting particular realization?
Well, I think it was more a structure of the story. Of course, there is a periodization. In the book, I don't. That was just a lecture. I don't do the 5 acts in the book, but I thought it would work to tell the story. I don't want to make too much of that, but obviously there was I'll tell you, when I started writing the book, I actually only wanted to write about 1918, 19, and this quite interesting phenomenon of these Jewish revolutionaries. But then, of course, not just Jewish revolutionaries, most of the Jews were against the revolution. So this Jewish aspects of the revolution. But then I felt, wow, there's so much in the material which needs to be written in the years to come. So these were the other acts in the way. Yes.
Was Munich unique in that regard? Because there were workers and revolutionary councils all over Germany during that period. And to what extent were Jews involved in setting those councils up and gaining administrative posts and so on?
Yeah, so there were others, and especially in Berlin, you had some Jewish leaders as well. But Munich was unique in the fact that you had really, if you look at it, almost all of the leaders happened to be Jewish, and it's hard to, there are reasons for it, but it's not easy to explain, and I don't think there's another example. The only one that comes close might be Budapest, where you had also a much more radical revolution under a Jewish Hungarian leader, Bela Kun. But what is interesting in Munich, I apologize for those who were there for lunch, but I talked about these aspects earlier today. They actually happened to be Jewish in a way that they didn't deny, most of them didn't deny their Jewishness. So you had a Rosa Luxemburg in Berlin, who was maybe the most important Jewish, or best known Jewish, but she really distanced herself very much from any, she happened to be born to a Jewish family, but that's all she would, admit. Or Trotsky, there was nothing, Trotsky wasn't important for him. He didn't consider himself the Jew, he was the Russian Revolution. These were some of those, the very leaders, actually, it mattered to them. Not in the way, as I said before, that they were part of an organized Jewish, that they were going to synagogue. None of them. But for example, when this letter was published, which I quote from the more conservative Orthodox Jew, saying that these aren't real Jews. Erich Mühsam, one of the revolutionaries, answered with another letter out of his prison cell, and he said, we are the better Jews, actually. We're the real Jews, because we follow the tradition of the prophets of the Old Testament, and not you capitalist, bourgeois Jews. We're the better. And that is interesting. Instead of denying or not caring, they said, we're Jewish too, but we represent the real essence of being Jewish. So that's interesting. And and as I said, that you don't have in other cities. You have a Rosa Luxemburg, but she's already murdered in January 19. You have a very short-lived, actually the only other Jew who was at some point at the top of a government was very short in Prussia, but Hirsch, but he was, nobody remembers, he was not that important. Eisner played a very important role at that time, and also national. Yes?
All those Jews like Eisner, were they all exported from Russia or any of them?
So they were all German Jews, with one exception of Lillian, but all were German Jews. But they were not Bavarian Jews. And for Bavarians, that might have played. It's like, but Florida, Texas is for me the kind of equivalent in America to Bavaria. I guess if you're not Texan, become governor or whatever. I guess there are examples, but it's hard. In Bavaria, if you're, Bavarians and Prussians historically don't like each other. And then sometimes I don't know for some people what was worse, that he was a Jew or a Prussian or a socialist. So they were Germans. But then, it's interesting. The Nazis always said, they're not indigenous, they're not real, they're not from here. But most of the Nazis who were in Bavaria at the time were also not from here. Hitler was from Austria. Alfred Rosenberg, who was the leader of this right-wing circle at the time, was from the Baltic, there was a Baltic German, and others were from other places of Germany too. So there were many people in Munich at the time who came from other places. But it clearly weakened their position in Bavaria with many, also many Bavarian Jews who said, you're not the real Bavarian Jews. But they were almost all of them were German, not Russian. Yes. Mm. Absolutely. I mean, that's what Hitler was. At one point, he said, what Moscow for the communists and Mecca is for the Muslims is Munich for our movement. I mean, it was Munich where everything started, and many of them were not, as I said, were not from Goebbels from the Rhineland. That many were not from. But most were different. But that's where they gathered. That's where the movement. And it honestly was very hard, and I don't have it clear answer. It's very hard for me to find the real reason why Munich, which before World War I, according to Thomas Mann, but almost everyone, was a very liberal city. It might have just happened that many of those people ended up there after World War I. You can probably come up with all kinds of explanations, but I didn't find one that really convinced me to say, that's why. It just happened to be that these people were in Munich. Now, Hitler was in Munich already before World War I, and he returned after the war. And that, of course, made it short. Yeah. Yeah. Like what? Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, and that was, of course, happened in Berlin. There were other, yeah. No, I mean, it wasn't only Munich, obviously, but Hitler and the Nazi Party, that started. I mean, he was sympathetic to it, but he wasn't an active part of it. Yes. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's really an important question, and I ask it myself very often. And I think we all know what came afterwards. They didn't. And when is the time? When is the time to know that things are really bad? Look, you could say there was a terrible attack in Pittsburgh a few years ago. There are anti-Semitic acts in this country, unfortunately, last years. Is there a time when maybe it's time to go to Israel? I mean, I'm just apathetic here. And I think that's what I tried to say. So my lecture was about anti-Semitism, but for most Jews, even in Munich, that was not their daily experience. They know it happened to Mr. Frank or his family. There was still a kind of singular case. There weren't like beatings every week or every month of Jews in the streets. And it's so hard, I said this in our lunch talk. We, as historians, we try to say we have to write history as if we don't know what happened later. But we can't. We know what happened after 1933. And somebody might, if I'm saying hypothetically, Hitler had not come to power, it could have happened. There was in no way was there no other option for Germany. Hitler could have been died in 1923, like some of his comrades. Maybe we would write the history of 1923 these years very, very different. Oh, it was an unfortunate episode, but it all cooled down and came back. And that's, I think, what most German Jews thought. And don't forget, they were really rooted in Germany. I mean, 2 years ago, Germany, all over Germany, there were big celebrations. It was 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany. It wasn't like, we don't know, there's no continuity, but the first document of Jews in Germany, the first, just evidence we know, is from the year 321 in the city of Cologne, under the Romans. And many of those German Jews had roots which go back centuries. Many prided themselves that they were longer in Germany than Christianity, because they came to the Romans, and 321 is the first document we have. We assume they've been there before they were Christian in Germany. So they were not guests or strangers, and like many others, they thought, even after 33, as we know, that Hitler would disappear and go away. And nobody could foresee how bad it gets. And I think, and again, the situation is still different, but when things get worse, we think, oh, when is it so bad that we should go somewhere else? Americans don't think to go somewhere else. And take France, right? So is the situation so bad for Jews in France today that they should leave? Some people think so, but others don't. And for most people, they're not just Jews, they're also French or Americans, right? And I think that's how German Jews felt then. And they didn't, yes, there was anti-Semitism in history before, but there was no precedent of Auschwitz. There was no precedent why it killed. So that was beyond imagination. I mean, that's an imperfect answer I can give, but I'm trying to not judge them from what we know today. And as I said, some left, they didn't think it was so bad in Berlin, so they left for Berlin. There were also Zionists back then, I should say, but they were a small minority. And the Zionists who actually decided to go themselves instead of helping the poor, I mean, the real poor Jews in that sense, the miserable Jews, were the Jews of Eastern Europe, especially in the early 20s when, I mean, tens of thousands of Jews were killed in Ukraine and mainly Ukraine in pogroms, but also in civil wars. Great book out of Jeffrey Weidling on that. He calls it the Holocaust, but that's where German Jews were going. You know, there were more Jews immigrating to Germany in the early 20s from Eastern Europe, but it was still much better than Eastern Europe. Yes. It's in the book, so I think all I found on that is in a chapter of the book. But I thought, since I'm based most time now in Washington, I thought, oh, that's great. I don't even have to go for part of my research because what's there was amazing. And then, of course, Washington has all the other resources like the Library of Congress. I found newspapers which appeared in Munich, which are not even available in Munich. So I think it's. I don't think I'll find more. Jeff. Mm. Yeah, I don't know if the book that looked into Frankfurt. There might be something. Frankfurt was really different in the way that, and Berlin had the largest number of Jews, but Frankfurt has had the highest percentage of Jewish population of a major city in Germany. But it seems, and at some point was the only really large city in the later 1920s that had a Jewish mayor. But I don't think that in 1819 I didn't come across as like Jewish revolutionaries in Frankfurt that were. I mean, of course, Frankfurt is in many other respects very important for a German Jewish history. The Frankfurt School, and Adorno, Horkheimer, and many other intellectuals became important. But not so much in 1819. The university, which was very new in Frankfurt, was founded mainly by local Jews in their donations and so on. But that's different, yeah. Huh? Last chance? Okay. Thank you for your questions and for having me.